Hey there, my name is ARTFX and welcome back to my channel. Today we're gonna talk about drum and bass drum patterns. Let's get to it. I wanted to talk a little bit about drum and bass drum patterns, and I guess this video is a little bit more for people who are just starting out with the genre and just want to get a little bit of an idea of what kind of drum patterns there are and what you can do to get started writing some drum and bass drums. So, I've got a couple of samples that I selected. I've got a kick drum, I've got a snare drum, I've got another smaller version of that same snare drum, and then I've got two hi-hat samples. So when it comes to writing drum and bass drums, there's a couple of things we need to talk about. The first thing is the tempo. The tempo is very important. When you're gonna make drum and bass, you're gonna be sitting somewhere between 160 to 180 beats per minute, but most of the time people will be somewhere around 170. My tempo right now is set to 172, which is a tempo that I really like. You could use 174, 176, 175, doesn't really matter. Use whatever you want. I like 172. So, for the most basic drum and bass drum pattern, let me just turn this into a 1-bar loop. And let me show you the most basic drum and bass drum pattern out there. The most basic pattern will have a snare drum sitting on the second beat and on the fourth beat. So let me change this to 1/8 notes. Yeah, let's do 1/8 notes. Well, let's do 1/16. That might actually be easier. So I want to have a snare on the second beat right here, and I want to have a snare on the fourth beat right here. So if I now play this, we're going to have a basic drum and bass snare pattern. And now what we need to do is we need to add in a kick drum to really get that drum and bass type feeling. So the basic drum and bass rhythm is actually a two-step rhythm, which is very common in other genres such as hip-hop, for instance. But it's pretty much just a two-step rhythm at a higher tempo. So what is a two-step rhythm? Well, if you have a snare on the second beat and on the fourth beat, if you then put a kick drum right at the first beat, and then instead of putting a kick drum right on the third beat, we're going to put it right in between the third and the fourth beat. So on the off beat, right there. So we can remove that one. And now we have a really basic drum and bass drum pattern. And this is your typical two-step drum pattern. So you can already hear, that is the classic drum and bass pattern, right? So now let's add a hi-hat. So I have two hi-hats. One is a little bit louder than the other one. So let's use the loudest hat for the main hi-hat. So we can add the hi-hat in several different places. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to add the hi-hat on the, pretty much on 8 notes. So I'm just going to do this. So now we have a hi-hat on the 8 notes, and that's going to create this. There's a couple of other sounds that I have here that we can use to make this a little bit more interesting. I told you that I had the other snare drum, which is just a smaller sounding version of the main snare. So we can use that, and we can utilize that to create more syncopation within the drum pattern. So a thing very commonly used in drum and bass are ghost snares, and a ghost snare typically is just a version of your main snare that sounds slightly smaller or quieter or at a higher pitch or just shorter, or it's mainly just a snare drum that is very similar to your main snare but just smaller. And if we listen to these two snares, that's the main one. And that's like a smaller, tighter version of the main snare. So if I use that now in between these hi-hat notes on the 16th notes, I can actually turn it into a really nice shuffle pattern. So, for instance, you can see we have the hi-hats going on here. If I place a ghost snare right here, listen to what happens. So that's already a little bit of a shuffly kind of pattern. Now let's add another one right in front of that kick drum. And now let's listen to the pattern. So you can hear that it really turns into a shuffly kind of drum and bass pattern now. Now let's finish this off by adding some 16th note hi-hats in between the main hi-hats. So I'm gonna do this. And now if we play it, and there you have it. That's the most basic drum and bass pattern out there. So let's take this pattern and let's see if we can switch it up. So what other types of patterns are there? Because there's a lot of things you can do. First of all, I'm gonna turn off the ghost snare, and I'm also gonna turn off the 16th note hat, and I'm only gonna focus on the main pattern first. So we have this going right now, and we can play around with the actual, the placement of the kick drum, for instance. We can maybe do a double kick at the start. And let's say I want to make this a bit more interesting. I can duplicate the length, so just make it twice as long. And I can, for instance, only do a double kick at the start. And create something like this. And you can bring the ghost snares and the 16th note hats back in if you want, and that'll turn it into this. Now obviously the sounds I'm using right now are very basic sounds, so we can probably do a lot more with them if we use, well, more processed sounds and if we start layering things up. But this is just to demonstrate the actual patterns that you can make. So that's an option. We could also maybe do this one, so let's do a 16th note kick in front of the snare. We get a completely different vibe. So you can hear by just playing around with the kick drum pattern, you can create very interesting kind of rhythms. Let's say we place a kick drum on the 8th note after the first snare. There you have another rhythm. We could also maybe do something like this, where we create a very interesting rhythm, and that sounds like this. See, so we can really start playing with that. And another thing we can definitely play around with is those ghost snares. So let's say I want to have a ghost snare. I can play around with the placement of those as well. For instance, I don't have to put them on the 16s. I could also put them on 8th note grid lines and turn it into something like this. So let's do that here as well. Very interesting. Definitely sounds good. We could also move them over here. Let's see what happens. Let's move the kick drum over to the first beat here. So you can hear how you can really start playing with different types of patterns here. And there's a lot of options that you can use. There's a lot of things that you can do. So if we go back and let me remove the ghost snares again. So for instance, what other types of things you could do? Let's say you want to do something completely different. Well, we could do something like this as well. Instead of having only 2 snares, I could have 3 snares. So I'm also going to place a snare on the 3rd beat, and that'll turn it into this. That's a rhythm that was used in, I think it was a Matthias track, if I'm not too... Well, if I'm not wrong. I think it was a Matthias track that was using this rhythm, or it was a June Miller track. Yeah, I think it was a June Miller track. But now I'm slightly confused. I don't know exactly for sure, but it was either a Matthias or a June Miller track that used this kind of a snare rhythm, and it works really well if the tune calls for it. Definitely interesting. So, what else could we do? Well, let's just get rid of everything, and let's bring our hi-hat pattern back. So now I just have a 1/8 note hi-hat pattern. Let's see if we can make a little bit of a more interesting kick drum pattern. So instead of the pattern that I did just now, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna do this. So now I place a kick drum on the first beat, then another kick drum in between the second and the third beat, and then another kick drum on the fourth beat, and then I'm repeating that pattern. This creates this pattern. This is a different style of drum and bass pattern that you also see a lot, and what they would do in this particular instance, instead of having the snare on the second and the fourth beat, like with a regular drum and bass pattern, if we do that, it falls on that snare. So, or it falls right on top of that kick. That's not really what you want. So instead of doing that, you could go for a different style rhythm here. Let's say instead of having the snare on the second and the fourth beat, I'm gonna do the snare on the second beat, and then on the off beat in between the third and the fourth beat. Right there. Let's do it here as well. Now what you get is you get this style pattern. And this style pattern is very similar, but it has a completely different vibe. And that is just because that snare is on a different spot. See, the kick drum is a very low frequency sound, and the snare drum is a higher frequency sound, at least higher than the kick drum. So when you're making a drum pattern, the kick drum and the snare kind of have their own purpose within the drum loop. So the snare, because it is a higher pitch, it's kind of like an accent sound. So it kind of accentuates that particular beat. And if you then place it on an offbeat, you can really use that snare drum to accentuate that particular moment in the drums. So you can really hear that that snare drum gives it a very interesting rhythm. And you can play around even more with it. And what else could we do? Let's see. We could go something weird, like a kick drum in between these hi-hats. Might not be the most energetic pattern, but it's still a pattern that is perfectly feasible to use in drum and bass, I guess. What else can we do? Let's get rid of the kicks. Let's drop the snares back on the 2 and the 4th, so the 2nd and the 4th beat. Now what can we do here? Let's say I want to put a kick drum on the first beat. Now I could also put a kick drum right here. So instead of having it here and create that rhythm, I can also do it here and create this rhythm. Very similar, but has a different vibe. I can put it right here and create a very interesting vibe as well. This has a little bit more of a swing kind of vibe. It's not technically swing because it's perfectly straight on the beat, but because it falls, that kick drum falls in between the two hi-hat notes here on a 16th note grid line, it kind of sounds a little bit like swing. It's not swing though. Like I said, it's perfectly on the grid, but it kind of sounds like it because it gives you the impression, because it doesn't fall right on top of one of these hi-hat notes, but actually falls in between, and thus it gives you that impression. If we add our 16th note hats back again, you kind of lose a little bit of that swing kind of vibe again, because like I said, it's technically not swing, but it just sounds like that because it falls in between the hi-hats. So now from this pattern, There's another very classic drum and bass pattern that is very similar to this one, and that is if you have this pattern and then you add a kick drum on the offbeat between the third and the fourth beat. Right there. Now, what you get is this. Again, very commonly used drum and bass pattern. So you can really see how I'm making very interesting patterns just by swapping notes around, just playing with the placements of the notes. And in drum and bass, it doesn't really matter what type of drum and bass you're making. Could be liquid drum and bass, could be heavy neurofunk. These patterns are gonna be roughly the same. The thing that'll change is the actual sound selection, so the sounds itself. So you'll use heavier kick drums for neurofunk, and you'll use more lighter sounding kick drums or more lighter sounding snare drums for liquid drum and bass. But the principle behind it, the actual technique behind it is pretty much exactly the same, and you will see the same drum rhythms across both genres. So when you're gonna do neurofunk style drums though, there's a couple of things you could do. For instance, repeated kicks. Like let's say we do this pattern, and I'm gonna remove some hi-hats for now. Let's do a 1/4 note hi-hat pattern. So literally just this. So I could, for instance, if I want to spice this up a bit and make it feel a little bit more energetic, I could introduce something like a double kick. So instead of having this like boom ka, I can do a double kick right here. And that gives a completely different vibe. Now, I haven't played with the velocities yet, but if I play with the velocities of these notes, it's gonna get an even different vibe. And it's going to sound a bit cleaner as well. Now let's maybe add some groove with the ghost snare. Or maybe put it somewhere here. Maybe use that other hi-hat on the 8th note. So on the offbeats. Again, very similar patterns. What else could we do? There's so many different types of things that you could do here. Mainly it all starts with just a regular two-step pattern. That's what you're usually going to start off with, and from there just playing around with the placement of the notes. So this is going to be your main pattern that you're most of the time starting off with. Now, if we go back to this pattern, let's say I want to spice this up. I can use these two kick drums and move them one note to the left, one grid line to the left. So now they're right in between these hi-hats, and this creates this. Very interesting pattern as well. If we want to turn this into a pattern that feels almost like it's offbeat and it's not really correct, then we could do this. Again, this could work just fine. Play around with double kicks again here. Or maybe do this. Again, really nice pattern. So now with just a few changes, I have this pattern here, which is just a regular two-step pattern, which is finished off by this pattern right here with a slight change at the end. Then I go back into my regular two-step pattern, but with a double kick at the start. And then at the end, I'm making a change here where I'm doing a switch up with the snare drum rhythm. And then I'm also changing it up right here at the end, where I'm basically just ending it off with a little bit of a different section, so a little bit of a variation. So now what we get is this. I'm gonna solo this entire thing. I'm gonna basically turn it into this, so I hope you can see this. Let me highlight the notes so you can all see them clearly. And now let's listen. So there you have it. That's a very, very basic demonstration of what you can do in drum and bass, and it's kind of like a really basic introduction on drum and bass drums. So that was it for this video. If you learned something, then please subscribe to this channel. I'm doing a lot more music production tutorials, I'm doing live streams, and I'm giving you guys content to get better at producing drum and bass music. So if you like drum and bass, and if you want to get better at making it, then please follow my channel, subscribe to my channel, and help me up to 100,000 subscribers. That would be absolutely awesome. So I also run a Discord server, so if you have a Discord account and you want to get in touch with me and a whole bunch of other like-minded music producers, then check out the invite link to my Discord server in the description below this video. So I'm going to be back with another tutorial soon. Without further ado, peace. Have a nice day. Peace.